Shared print. The first part of that is going to be an update on the critical corpus study. This has to do with our the CRL shared print agenda for the next 10 years. This involves the archiving and delivery through electronic access of shared serial collections. We're engaged in an effort to try to rationalize print sharing and archiving in the United States and Canada. And so we are gathering and disseminating a lot of data using the paper registry about the shared print and archiving programs that are happening in the U.S. and Canada. We're also calibrating our own development of shared collections and management of shared collections by what's being done. We are doing pretty good on the science, technology, and engineering front. Our partnership with Linda Hall provides over 50,000 science, technology, and engineering journals electronically to people at member institutions, researchers and member institutions, and that's gotten a phenomenal amount of use over the last years. Science, technology, and engineering, aside from Linda Hall and CRL, a lot of the shared print projects like West and Scholars Trust and Big Ten Academic Alliance and down to are focusing heavily on science, technology, and engineering journals. So we're turning our attention to the universe of titles in the humanities and social sciences out there. What are we finding about those titles? With the Mellon funding, we just completed an effort to develop and cost out a methodology and strategy to identify the critical corpus of journal literature. That means what's the whole entire universe of humanities and social science serials out there that are worth preserving by the research libraries. We did that by, to try to answer that question, we looked at the holdings of about 16 libraries aside from Linda Hall and CRL, Cornell University, Columbia University, New York Public Library, Princeton, and 12 of the Big Ten Academic Alliance libraries. We looked at about 2.5 million records, and we come up with a guesstimate of that the universe of titles out there, the humanities and social science titles out there that we need to worry about is about close to 500,000, probably over 500,000. There are a number of other libraries holdings, major research libraries holdings, that we hope to collect data on, and that will probably swell the number above. The actual number we came up with was about 462,850, and you can see the distribution of those holdings in the slide that's on the screen now. At 500,000 titles, CRL's building right now holds about 5 million volumes and volumes equivalents. Our estimate, our serial title holdings is about is less than 50,000. So we have a long way to go. We're right now determining what's not held by CRL among these titles, and then we will decide how to bring that to scale. I think bringing it to scale, what we mean by bringing it to scale is providing not only assurance that these titles will be retained by a responsible steward, but also agreements and commitments to serve and provide access to those materials by from other libraries of records and other holders of those critical serials. So anyway, we'll provide more on that at the council meeting that's coming up on May, the CRL's annual meeting on May 17th and 18th, Collections Forum. A big piece of that, this gives you a sense of the number of titles that are not archived anywhere, according to in comparison with the number of titles that are registered in the paper registry. So the paper registry is not a comprehensive registry of titles archived, serial titles archived, but it's probably the biggest one out there. So right now, less than a tenth of the titles, less than 10% of the titles in the critical corpus that we've defined so far are archived by even one library. So a big part of the CRL's shared collections agenda is the commitment to delivering collections electronically, and that means digitization of collections. A lot of our delivery of shared collections, CRL shared collections, is document delivery right now. Most of the use of Linda Hall library collections is document delivery, and that's a heavy usage. As many Linda Hall does at least as many document delivery request fulfillments every year to CRL members as CRL does. So that's fairly decent service. But we're also investing heavily in digitization, in strategic digitization. That is, digitization is not in response to document delivery requests. And we're close to 1 million pages a year that way. We want to make that more intentional, but first we wanted to be sure that we were on solid ground in our handling of intellectual property. And so we had Georgia Harper at the University of Texas years ago do an analysis of our policy and our approach to handling copyright, and felt that we had designed a sound approach. We wanted to get that looked at again in the wake of the Authors Guild suit and the other things that have happened since 2005, 2007. So we had Peter Yazzie do an analysis. His analysis came up with a number of conclusions. Essentially, our digital programs qualify as nonprofit educational uses. He also looked at it from the standpoint of fair use. And he said that our activities are transformative, so that gives us some justification for digitization of materials that may or may not be in the public domain. That they're transformational because we serve a new and different audience from the organizations and the individuals that were the market for these serials when they were originally published. Also, the documentary and informational character of the copyright material that we distribute, or the material that may be in copyright, is an important factor here. A lot of the protections that are provided by copyright are for creative works, or heavily slanted towards creative works, and most of what CRL is holding is material that relates to technology, it relates to commerce, it relates to government. And so we're pretty good on there. In general, it was Peter's opinion that the application, that the way we approach copyright is broadly consistent with what courts would accept as fair use. So we're encouraged by that, and that'll be important in moving forward. Our approach to digitization, our approach to management of intellectual property on materials that we digitize from the collections involves number one, Peter's liberal interpretation of fair use, or a liberal interpretation of fair use, but also our restriction of materials that may not be public domain, to restriction of access to them to people authorized and authenticated by our member libraries, which we can justify as being a research use for the most part. That plus a certain amount of risk assessment that we do. We will be seeking permissions from the publishers for digitization of materials that are in copyright, and in some cases that may involve, we may even get responses from those organizations, which will give us a better sense of what the risk is in digitizing material. At any rate, we really feel that sharing print, or that retaining print, is really very difficult to sustain without providing access to it as well. That the value proposition for just retention is relatively slim. So our approach is to augment that with electronic access. The last piece is our NEH project. CRL recently received NEH funding in the amount of about $75,000 under the research and development tier 1 funding. This is partial support for the planning phase of a project that builds on the data that we've been collecting in the paper registry, the data about holdings, serial print serial holdings that are being archived by various institutions. What we wanted to do was to look at the records of the Brittle Books projects, various Brittle Books projects over the last several years, or over about 2 decades or so, that were funded by the NEH and by others, that included serial collections, and see what we could do to harvest, see the extent to which we could harvest information about the serial titles that have been microfilmed or reformatted under these programs. We think that the body of serials preserved in microfilm, and also even in digital format, could potentially provide an important backup or layer of redundancy for the new and emerging efforts to archive those serials in print format. And so what we're saying is that if we can determine which serials have been effectively reformatted for preservation purposes, then that's actionable information for libraries trying to decide whether to retain or to further develop or even to conserve holdings, and that will add to our pool of important data, or of actionable data that now consists largely of the paper registry. This is a grant that will help develop CRL's capability to capture, aggregate, and provide access to data. It's a 12-month project, and it's actually started. The funding was effective January 1st, so we'll be reporting on that as time goes on. We do have some time for questions and answers, and so if you have any, feel welcome to put those in the chat, to use the chat function. I know I gave you a lot of information in a very short time, so it may take a while to process that information, but we'd be happy to entertain questions or comments that you have at this point. We'll give it a few minutes for people to, if we don't have any questions or comments, let me go back up and fill a little bit of the time with some more details from the earlier part of the presentation. The critical corpus next phase, we hope, is to include about another 7 or 8 libraries that are beyond the initial pool of libraries whose holdings we analyzed and we aggregated early on. Those libraries in the first phase of the critical corpus analysis were, as I said, 12 libraries from the Big Ten Academic Alliance, Cornell University, the 3 recap libraries, Columbia University, Princeton University, and New York Public Library, that has kind of along with CRL and Linda Hall, that has kind of a geographic, it's not well geographically distributed, and so the libraries we targeted for the next time around include at least two of the University of California libraries, as well as the Downsview group at the led by the University of Toronto in Canada. So. I'm not seeing Jeff Kosikoff. Oh. We do have one question. The critical corpus is everything the members have. Everything that all the serials that the libraries surveyed have is what we said, that the purpose or the rationale for the critical corpus was to cover. Well, the plan was to cover 20 major research libraries, and the rationale was that if we had 20, if we included the print serial holdings of 20 of the largest U.S. and Canadian research libraries, and those libraries had a geographic distribution and also were a mix of public and private, and newer and older libraries, that would defensively be the corpus of, or at least will give us a defensible list of titles that were the universe of titles worth preserving, at least worth preserving by the collective group. The question is, shouldn't we include all the CRL members in that pool? So since we're trying to serve all CRL members, the members are the community of interest here, or the stakeholders here. That would be a really big list. We have about over 200 libraries at CRL, and so it would probably take us a few years to get that list, and possibly more money than Mellon is willing to give us as well. But I can see the rationale for including that. No, we felt that we had to draw the line somewhere, and that if we came up with a list, a testbed group of libraries that was diverse and extensive, that we would that would give us a defensible list, and a list that was fairly broad in scope. Any kind of critical corpus we define is going to be artificial to some extent. The totality of the serial holdings of libraries in the United States could probably be calculated using OCLC, but that would be extremely rough, it seems to me, given the amount of redundancy and ambiguity in a lot of title holdings records, or title bibliographic records in OCLC. So we had to go with a somewhat arbitrarily defined testbed. It will be a working list, but we felt we did have to have a list so that we could move forward and get a sense of what really the outer limits of this universe of materials that we're trying to preserve, what that outer limit is. And so that's what we came up with. The next phase of this we're in discussions about the next phase of a critical corpus, of the critical corpus definition, but we're moving ahead with the data we have already, and that's helping define what CRL is doing in the way of shared print and print archiving. We are now looking at this list of close to 500,000 titles against the list of titles that CRL actually has under its roof and control of it. And what we don't have, we will be targeting, and libraries that do have, for potential partnership libraries or shared print programs. And we think we have the makings of a good set of incentives for getting libraries to commit to retention and sharing of collections with the CRL membership. So I think I've used up all my time, and sorry, I'm trying to look at the screen and my papers at the same time. Yeah, the CRL goals there's a question about the comparison or the relationship between CRL's goals of 500,000 and the 100,000 that Rosemont's team, that the Rosemont group has been proposing. CRL's 500,000 really is just humanities and social sciences. We already have between CRL and Linda Hall, about 60-some thousand titles committed in science, technology, and engineering. So the 100,000 Rosemont goal is a goal that's somewhere between the two of those.